Welcome to the Propanefitness podcast. I am here with Dr. Anthony J. He is a biochemist and the author of Estrogeneration. So this really hinges around the exposure that we have to environmental estrogens and how that's been affecting us on an individual and a systemic population level in terms of infertility, sex drive, obesity, and a lot of kind of horrible downstream effects. And it's the really annoying thing about this is that if you listen to this podcast, you're focused on making gains in your physique. And this is like the exact opposite thing that you want to be constantly exposed to. It always annoys me that estrogen has to be the environmental hormone that we're exposed to. Why couldn't it have been endorphin or testosterone or something that's actually going to improve our lives? But unfortunately, it's estrogen. And Anthony J is the expert on this. Welcome, Anthony.
Hey, thanks for having me. That's pretty funny. That's a good point.
So annoying.
We would take testosterone.
Well, it feels as though the world is just conspiring to ruin our gains. But
well, the worst thing for me is now I'm the estrogen guy. You know, so that's a weird situation because of course you never want to be the estrogen guy and known as the estrogen guy, but I can't help it. So.
It could be Brett Contreras being known as the ass man. I don't know if you've seen him. He's just like Mr. Evidence on the glutes.
That's funny. Or the UTI guy or something. Yeah.
But you look pretty testosterone-y. You know, you're a bald guy with a beard. Like it's, I think at least you're the picture of masculinity on that side.
And for viewers, I'm sure you can see my eyes are a little bit bloodshot. I was actually up last night. So in my time zone, it's 6 a.m. as you know. But I was up, which wouldn't be a problem, right? Normally, but I was up fishing last night until about 3 a.m. So
fishing,
short night. Yeah, I was fishing last weekend too, and I caught a 46-inch muskie.
Oh, amazing! And
you guys probably don't have those over there, but it's kind of like a big pike without the spots. They usually have stripes.
Okay. Why really 3 a.m.? Cool. Is that just the time that they hang around?
Yeah. The real big ones seem to be. They bite better at night, so I chase them at night.
Well, I appreciate you coming on at 6 a.m. That is certainly commitment. So, yeah, Anthony, just to give our readers a quick rundown as well, that Johnny and myself saw a couple of your interviews, we've read some of your stuff, fascinating stuff, like check out some of the other stuff that he's done as well, but it got us thinking that actually we want to try and test some of these things ourselves and see what impact it has on both our blood levels and also our physiques. So Johnny and I have taken a bunch of measurements of, our body anthropometrics, so measurements of our body fat, weight, and photos, and blood tests of all of the male hormones plus estrogen. And we're going to do it 12 weeks apart, taking on a lot of Anthony's recommendations in his book to see the effects of that over time. And as predicted, my results were low testosterone, and not so much low total testosterone, but it was the low free test. And so I had elevated SHBG, sex hormone binding globulin, which I'm sure Anthony will get into later. But he mentioned that this is actually a sign that there is some exposure potentially to environmental estrogens, and it's something that we might be able to change. But some of the things that I'm doing to try and eliminate this would be, and it's so wide, but it's like trying to avoid plastics, particularly plastics that are cooked, that contain food, or heating with plastics, touching receipts, using standard detergents, candles, dairy, meat, lots of cosmetics, plastic bags, cling films, using the word grapefruit. Oh, damn it, grapefruit! I've said it now. And there's just so much stuff
that's the worst. That's the worst one if you were to prioritize them.
So there is a lot of things that have to be done, but what we want to find out really is whether making these changes, whether these are things that are within our power to actually elicit a difference in our blood hormone levels. And so, Anthony, I realize you've done a lot of other podcasts about your general kind of approach, so I don't want to make you have to repeat yourself, but would you be able, just for anyone who hasn't heard of you, to go over kind of some of the principles that were underlying your book?
Yeah, for sure. So the idea with the book is meant to be simple and readable for normal people. First of all, I know you're a medical student and an expert, But you know, and some people like you, a lot of times think it's too simple. I know you personally don't, or maybe you do. I don't know, but some people think I take it too simple and too casual. But the point there is just so average people can read the book. I mean, otherwise, I feel like what's the point of even writing if I can't communicate with non-experts. Um, so what I tried to do there is lay out all the artificial estrogens that we're exposed to, and those are chemicals that are acting on our body like estrogen, disrupting our delicate hormone balance. And there's a balance between estrogen, testosterone. And so what I did was I made a top 10 list, and basically the top 10 artificial estrogens that we're exposed to every day. So yeah, like I was talking to somebody yesterday. I do DNA consulting also, and I was talking to somebody who their father was exposed to Agent Orange, and they had all kinds of estrogenic effects. This is the daughter of somebody exposed to Agent Orange I was consulting with, and I mean, Agent Orange definitely disrupts your testosterone and your estrogen, but the thing is, it's not really in my book because we're not exposed every day to Agent Orange, thank goodness. But we are exposed to a lot of different chemicals with sunscreens and soaps and red food dyes, artificial red food dyes. And so this top 10 list I put together, it doesn't mean there's exactly 10 artificial estrogens. It means those are the ones that I see personally in people's everyday environments.
So you were saying that these look like the effect of some of these things, the top 10 plus obviously several of the other ones, that some modifiable, some non-modifiable. What do you think is the impact that they're having on people day to day?
Yeah, oh, for sure. They bring up your SHBG, like you said, um, lower testosterone. And I did some YouTube videos on this if people want to see like really the technical research, because I go through the citations a little bit. And the citations are all in the book too. But um, what I did videos on, there are three different aspects: total testosterone, which decreases when you're exposed to these artificial estrogens; free testosterone, of course, which is super important, more important than total, because if you don't have usable testosterone, then what's the point? But then even more interesting was the artificial estrogens, they block binding to the receptor, which is a hard concept for lay people to grasp. But what I try and do is I use an analogy to hockey, and because I used to be a hockey player, and or maybe, yeah, I guess hockey is the best analogy. I was going to say maybe rugby or something for you, but I don't know enough about rugby to use the analogy. But at least in hockey, right, you have a goal, you've got a goalie in front of the goal, and you're trying to shoot a puck into the goal. And imagine if you put 50 players out on the ice to try and score the goal, but if you put a piece of plywood in front of the goal, like you completely blocked the goal, you can't get any points. So literally, if you're blocking the receptor, it doesn't matter if your testosterone is massively high if it can't be utilized. And I'm tending to call that testosterone sensitivity. It's kind of like insulin sensitivity, and that's harder to quantify from a biohacker perspective, but it's real as well.
So this is interesting because this is like it's flat out blocking the effect of your testosterone. And a lot of the stuff that we talk about in terms of hormone optimization is that we're maybe like, for someone who doesn't train, doesn't lift or whatever, if they're worrying about their testosterone, which is quite a common question we get, is that it's majoring in the minors, in that they're trying to optimize something which maybe won't have much of a clinical effect on them. But in the sense of and that was my opinion up until I heard some of your stuff, and you were talking about the actual doses that we're exposed to, and I was like, bloody hell, this is not just like changing us within the normal ranges. And I've proven for myself as well with my blood test that I was below the clinical range for testosterone, and that range is meant to cover like from a 18-year-old guy up to like a 70-year-old man. So
Right.
it's not as if
It's a pathetic range,
yeah,
frankly. That's at the low end.
exactly. So to be below the low end of that is like, that's subnormal for an old man. So it really is something that is clearly having much more of an effect, and measurable effect, than I thought was just kind of tweaking with minor stuff. And let me know if I'm wrong here, but you mentioned that the doses that, or the level of estrogen, of estradiol that should be in someone's bloodstream normally, for men or women, should be 20 nanograms per deciliter, whereas
Correct.
the doses that we're exposed to in a lot of these environmental estrogens would be the equivalent of thousands of nanograms per deciliter.
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah. And it
So
might be nanograms per. I just want to check on that. It might be nanograms per liter. Um, but yeah, you're probably right. I honestly can't remember off the top of my head because that's early.
that's fine. So yeah, 6 a.m.
But
So it's
some of
orders
these
of
different
magnitude
some of the
large.
different hormones, it gets complicated slightly because some of the different hormones they use nanograms per liter and some they use nanograms per deciliter, and then some of them in UK especially they completely throw all that out the window and use like nanomoles per microliter or whatever. They use some totally different thing. And so when I'm consulting for people from Europe or Australia or UK, I get confused because they start changing the units.
Mm.
But yeah, you're exactly right. Like 20 to 400 is the range between men and women. And what I did in my book is I translated all the units to make it relevant to that same, to the estrogen units. So that when I'm talking about atrazine, which is a herbicide used in North America, I was translating that to the same values that we think of when we're talking about estrogen. And yeah, it's
Right.
insane. It's insane. Atrazine was a perfect example because that one was 700,000 nanograms per liter or per deciliter, whichever one the units were for estrogen. I made that way more confusing than it should be, but just in case somebody's fact checking us and it's deciliter instead of liter or the other way around, I just want people to know.
But
Um,
regardless, because so yeah, I mean, I know it's 6 a.m., but 700,000 per deciliter or per liter, that's a factor of 10 compared to, thousands of times. So one extra
yep.
zero or not, it is a very large dose of estrogen that we're getting from a source that we shouldn't be, and it is pretty
I think
worrying.
atrazine over there, I think, is still either barely used or illegal, correct?
In Europe, yeah, I think it is. We're
What
quite
about
lucky over here that we have a lot more regulation over additives to food and pesticides and that kind of thing. I'm sure there's still a lot of them, but
yeah, so you have an advantage. I mean, you talk about your testosterone being low. I mean, come over here. You
yeah,
really want to suppress that.
yeah, fair enough. So, what do you think is the impact on people from having these large doses of exogenous estrogens?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing and kind of the culmination of my book, the reason I really was inspired to write it is the epigenetic impact. And that's a harder one to quantify because I've looked into doing my epigenetics, having it sequenced. So you can do 23andMe, right, for $100
Mm,
or 80 pounds or whatever.
yeah,
And,
nice.
you know, and, that's cheap, it's easy, it's your DNA code, it's great. But epigenetics is interesting to me because, well, I study it. I literally do research on epigenetics at the Mayo Clinic currently, but because it changes, right? So let's say you decided to tweak your diet, it would be interesting to be able to look at certain epigenetic marks and see if you're modifying those marks. But when I looked to do my epigenetic sequence, it was $20,000.
Oh,
So
okay.
that's way out of reach, right? And the sad thing is we do this stuff in the lab all the time, so
But just to do it privately costs that much. Is that the?
yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
So it's way out. It's totally inaccessible. But these artificial estrogens, without a doubt, they impact your epigenetics. And the importance of that for people is that it means it can be passed to future generations. These health problems that you're accumulating, they're like tattoos on your DNA. You literally are passing them to future offsprings, and that includes infertility.
see, the the thing that I'd like to see is if you like you to address if you can is like when I've mentioned some of this stuff that I'm doing, some of these blood tests and the changes that I'm making, I got very much a tinfoil hat response from people being like, "Yusuf, calm down. Like it can't have that much of an impact." Like and so on. Whereas what you're saying here is that the doses are extremely high. It's not just like, oh, maybe it's slightly affecting us, but also that it's tattooing our DNA for subsequent generations.
Right.
So, is there anything that you've seen on the kind of measurable impact on, um, in terms of like how that translates into a quantifiable amount of change in people, whether it's physique or health or cancer rates or anything like that?
Oh yeah. Oh sure. I mean, and it's hard to say exactly, right? Because every time you do a population-based study with humans, there's so many variables. But what I can say for sure is that breast cancer in America is up 250% since 1980, right? And that seems to correspond real tightly with the increase in artificial estrogen exposures that we've had. Um, Fertility is definitely decreasing. Allergies are definitely increasing. I have all these numbers in my book, but um, obesity rates are just ridiculous. It's close to 1% per year in America. So right now we're about 40%. 10 years ago we were about 30%.
Oh man.
20 years,
Okay.
as a population. I mean, and that's not just like overweight. That's straight up obesity. So, and all of these things relate back to artificial estrogen. And another good example, just based on epidemiology, is suicide rates are increased in birth control users. Actually, that study was done in the UK. I think it was like 20,000 people too. I might be wrong, but as they introduced atrazine, this estrogenic herbicide I was mentioning before, they introduced that over in India, and suicides among farmers skyrocketed. And of course, all the scientists are kind of just debating with each other because we love to debate and we love to
Mm.
argue and we like to be skeptical. But I mean, come on, like let's start looking at the correlation between atrazine and just the farming community, because that's where all the suicides are happening. So you get depression too, because there's estrogen receptors in your brain. And I think that's where you start. As a scientist, you start looking at the activation of the receptor in cells. And that's the powerful argument with the lavender essential oil is
Mm.
that, a lot of people say, well, I don't get man boobs if I'm rubbing lavender essential oil, right? It's like, well, I know, but it doesn't mean it's not estrogenic, because in the New England Journal of Medicine, they published a study showing case study where they were just looking at a few people that had gynecomastia, man boobs, and then they removed lavender from all their personal care products, and their man boobs went away. And you could say, well, that's just a few people, but then they followed that up in that same research paper, looking at cells, the estrogen receptor activation, and sure enough, it's activating the estrogen receptor. And
See,
that's
that's what's fascinating, because there is both a mechanistic explanation for it as well as like empirical evidence. You took away the lavender and it reduced the man boobs, and so I think, yeah, the argument of like, oh well, I didn't get man boobs is quite weak when it's like, well, you ask those same people, would you take the contraceptive pill for fun then? Would you just take
yeah,
estrogen for a
yeah.
laugh, because it doesn't do anything? Like, well, no, probably not. So the answer is like, you don't want excess estrogen in your body, whether you're a male or female, I suppose. Um, it's
Right.
interesting as well. You said about the allergies too. Is that something that's related to estrogen?
Oh yeah, for sure. Yeah, all these artificial estrogens. What I started realizing when I was researching this was, the health impacts from artificial estrogen usually reflect some dysfunction of high natural estrogen, right? So where do you see high natural estrogen? In a pregnant woman, right?
Mm-hmm.
So women, they'll be, 20 to 400 nanograms per deciliter, but then when they get pregnant, it shoots up over 1,000. And what do you see? Well, you see some fat gains, let's be honest. And that's not a bad thing, because if a woman is pregnant, the fetus needs energy. If she can't find nutrition, which is historically a normal thing, in certain cases, not anymore, but, maybe our ancestors, they couldn't find nutrition. You need that fat. That's the most efficient storage form of energy. So there's a lot of different physiological changes that you see in pregnancy. And then when you look at artificial estrogens, sure enough, you see the fat gains. Sure enough, you see the hormone imbalance. Sure enough, you see infertility, because it acts on your sex organs. And then depression and allergies, because when you're pregnant, those hormones are acting on your brain. So you hear of when after women have babies, oftentimes they have depression because the hormones get off balance. But then also the allergies. Scientists say that estrogen is immunostimulative, an immunosuppressive, which of course doesn't really make sense.
Hmm.
You're stimulating the immune system and you're suppressing it at the same time, but that's what we find in studies, I mean, in research. And how that translates is when a woman is pregnant, her body cannot eat the fetus. You can't destroy the fetus, right? So you have to suppress your immune system. But at the same time, if you have to actively fight infections that are coming from the outside even more than ever. So that's an interesting thing. And I don't remember the different population-based studies and this and that, but allergies are definitely linked to all sorts of these different artificial. It seems like whenever they investigate BPA or phthalates or atrazine or whatever and how it affects the immune system, you always see the spike in allergies.
That's interesting, and like the suicide as well. I suppose like maybe something for people to be aware of, that estrogen is like, it's not just the female hormone. There's such a multi-system impact, I guess, because it's so high up on the chain of, or the cascade of physiological events that come downstream, that yes, it fills a physiological function within a pregnant woman and within women's menstrual cycles, but to be just ramping it up randomly almost is pretty scary.
Yeah.
And I'm glad that you're at kind of the forefront of this movement, because as you said, things like the introducing atrazine, spike in suicides with farmers, and then the producers trying to be like, oh no, that's nothing to do with the atrazine, don't worry about that. Like, there's, I mean, of course there's a financial incentive to keep it going, but also I suppose with anything, you mentioned that there is a delay between something having a risk and finding out what that impact is. And maybe we'll all find out that holding these devices close to our heads every day is going to have some impact in 20 years time, but it'll all be too late and we'll all die off of it or something. But yeah, like, I guess the fact is that like there is a delay between something happening and being a policy change, and you are putting together the evidence and realizing that actually maybe these things do warrant some further investigation. We have some of the data already to be able to make some changes, but it must feel like people are just not hearing you, or that it's not not that you're being suppressed. Like, I'm not saying it's the Illuminati are trying to, but there is almost a resistance to accept some of this evidence.
Sometimes, yeah. And it's funny because most people, they sort of just sweep it under the rug initially, but usually when I talk, like when I give talks or even podcasts like this, then people start to wake up a little bit and they say, okay, I see what he's saying. Let me check out his book or something like that. And then they really get it,
Mm-hmm.
and then they're recommending it, to their doctor friends and all this sort of thing. That's a big demographic actually of my book right now, is among doctors. I keep hearing about, like, I keep getting people come to me and they say, my doctor recommended this book.
Really?
Like, yeah, and that's a good place to start from my perspective. But in the UK, I'm sure the feeling is totally different.
I think so, but like maybe I've got a bias because I tend to tune out anyone who I think is a kind of weirdy sort of hippie type that has an agenda that doesn't seem
Agenda,
yeah.
yeah.
But when I saw your stuff, like you're very much based in the evidence, and the fact you are a researcher at the Mayo Clinic, you've got no particular agenda per se.
Yeah, no, and I try and keep it that way. I mean, I intentionally don't let companies sponsor me for anything, and I have a recommendation page on my website where I just say, here's the personal care products I use.
Yeah, right? I saw that and I was like,
and
yeah,
so and it's like, hey, you don't have to use those, like, I don't care. But I'm just going to tell you what I use because I'm tired of getting emails that say, what do you use for this? What do you use for that? And, and it's good because I do some research on that. I do investigate that for my own family. So it's like, well, let me throw this out there. So yeah, appreciate that. I appreciate cool. The recognition, though. Oh, somebody recognizes, that's a good thing.
Well, I think that's it, that when it comes from someone like yourself who is so deep in the evidence and not just... because obviously there's a lot of and it unfortunately it makes a lot of these new movements in health reduce their credibility when you see the person that's pushing it and you're like, this guy is just paranoid of the Western healthcare system in general, and therefore I've seen someone say, it was a fitness professional who was like, going to a hospital is the worst place you could ever go if you're ill, because look at all the people that die in hospital. And you're like,
Right.
Maybe they they die for another reason in hospital. But yeah. So like,
Yeah.
something I wanted to ask you, Anthony, is so we've got these doses, these very high equivalent doses of estrogen in the environmental products. How do you then quantify the impact of them on the human bloodstream? So you mentioned
Yeah.
things like detergent, wearing clothes that have been washed with detergent, for example.
Yep. Yep. Usually it's really difficult, especially for lay people. In the lab, it's not so difficult, but like for a layperson, it's pretty much impossible. You can't measure phthalates in your blood. You can't measure BPA. There's no like conventional test you can just ship away some blood to, and they'll just tell you your numbers. In the lab, we can totally do that. I can get some blood from you. I can look at your BPA levels, and that's what we do in the research, and that's what I'm base most of my evidence on are those types of studies, because I mean that's what I have, right? So there's that. There's straight up blood levels, and then so what you have to do is you have to look at those research studies, number one, but then also for the biohacker like yourself, who is just personally interested in kind of keeping track. I think what you're doing is exactly right. You have to go with the testosterone because natural estrogen levels, they oftentimes don't change with these artificial estrogen exposures. You'd think they would, but it's kind of a complex system. It's hard to predict. Even testosterone is hard to predict. Um,
So is it
but
that
testosterone is usually the best metric for lay
okay?
people.
And so your estradiol, your estrogen levels in the blood won't change. Is that because the xenoestrogens, the artificial ones, don't they interact with the receptor, but they don't show up on the blood test as estrogen?
Correct. Yeah.
Right,
Yeah,
I
because
see.
these even like for example, when you're looking at Olympic athletes and they're doping testosterone, right? Or they're doing some kind of steroid doping. What they do when they're in the organic chemistry labs is they make a testosterone molecule, but then they slightly change it so that it sneaks past these anti-doping agency tests. And I mean, these molecules look really similar to estrogen, but they're tiny changes, and then boom, they can't detect it. So those hormones, their subtle changes will just eliminate them from being detected on these tests because the tests are so darn sensitive, which is a good thing. I mean, we're measuring nanograms here, and that's a hard thing to do.
Mm.
But again, in the lab, it's not that hard. Our technology is phenomenal, and I can take dryer sheets, throw a bunch of clothes in the dryer, put them on somebody, and actually measure. And people have done this. There's papers. You can measure the increase in benzophenone, which is a sunscreen chemical that they oftentimes use. And then you can measure an increase in phthalates, from the perfumes. And that's a powerful problem, like that's an indication that we've got a problem when you start spiking your blood
So these
with
will show
those.
positively on the blood test. So presumably
Oh, yeah.
things
Oh, yeah.
like phthalates, benzothenones, BPA, these are all they're getting into our bloodstream, and they're
Oh, yeah. Yeah. In fact, they did a study with perfume users, for example, pregnant women, of course, because that was a target audience that they're most concerned about.
hmm.
Um,
Is that for the
and
teratogenic effects, so like the birth defect
well,
risk?
yeah, that and usually when you expose, at least in animal models, when you expose them to artificial estrogens, when they're pregnant is when when you see the longest term changes in future generations. So if you're exposed as a fetus, all those stem cells get messed up, and it's more predictable. If you're exposed as an adult, it's not as bad, frankly, because your sperm cells might not get blasted,
I see.
and your epigenetic marks might not change at all, or they might change less dramatically in your sperm cells, and then you pass those on to future generations, and you don't see it. It's harder to predict. But when you're in the womb, right, all those stem cells seem to get impacted. And what was I going to say? What was the point? What were
So
we talking about before?
how these things get into the bloodstream, and do they remain there? Um, so I
Yeah.
suppose.
Well, I was
Um,
going to say, I was just going to mention this one study, right? They were measuring pregnant women, and perfume users had almost 200% more phthalates in their blood compared to non-perfume users. Um, so I mean, they study this all the time, and there's just such a connection between these personal care products with
when
phthalates
you say they have two hundred
increases.
percent more phthalates, that means the other. people, they
Yeah.
must have been getting phthalates in their blood from some other
Oh yeah.
source.
Oh, for sure.
But
And
it's
that's
not
the
an
problem.
organic compound. It's not something that,
No. Yeah.
yeah.
And you never find people with zero, frankly. You
Wow,
just
okay.
don't. And they've tried, right? Like there's a group of scientists that went up to northern Alaska looking for tribes of people to get blood from and to get fat tissue and all this. And I mean, that's what they did. That's what they ended up doing. And they were trying to look at breast cancer cells and get this, Yusuf, because you're a scientist, you recognize you've probably even done some rotations in labs,
Mm.
presumably. Um, what really drives me insane is when you're doing research in labs. All right, let's say I take some of your cells, right? It's called primary culture. If I
Hmm.
literally take cells from you, put them in a dish with some liquid, and grow those cells. Now they often change when they're in a dish because they're no longer signaling with other cells, right? And so you usually want to do experiments real quick after you take them out of a person, right? In those primary cells, but most people don't. Most people grow them for a long time, a couple weeks, and they start to morph and change. But it is what it is. That's just one of the difficulties with scientific research on cells. But um, what's nutty is you're growing those cells in plastic dishes, number one,
Yeah,
right?
I was gonna ask about that, but
Oh yeah, yeah, and then number two, you're storing the liquid. So you have this artificial blood, right, that you
mhm.
grow the cells in because you can't just sit them there in the dry air; they're gonna die. So you have this stuff. It's got sugar, it's got amino acids, it's got all these vitamins, that the cells need. They call it minimal essential media. They call it MEM. And anyways, um, the crazy thing to me is I mean, number one, we're growing all the cells in sugar, for the
Mhm.
most part. Most of them barely have any fats. This tiniest minimal amount of fats, but then they have like 25 millimolar of glucose, which is like fivefold more than you would ever have in your bloodstream. So number one, we're selecting and studying cells that are practically diabetic,
Okay.
and then we're making conclusions based on that. But then number two, which is even worse, we're growing them in plastic. The liquid that we grow them in is stored in plastic, and then we put in this. Most scientists, not myself, if you look at my research publications, you'll see I grow my cells in phenol-free media. But most
Right.
scientists put a red dye in their media in the liquid they
It's
grow the
so
cells
hard
in.
to
It's
avoid, isn't it? It's just like,
yeah,
but
yeah, yeah,
presumably,
and
when they're doing comparisons, they would control for like the baseline level of whatever stuff is coming from the plastics, by
yeah.
just
Well, the
testing
problem,
the water or
the
something.
well, the difficulty is that let's say you took cells out of your body, right? Let's say we're looking at stem cells, adipose-derived mesenchymal stem cells, right?
Mm.
AMSCs. So you take a liposuction, you spin out the stem cells, you put them on a dish, you grow them for a week, and then you do some kind of a study. Like let's say we add lavender oil to those cells, right?
Hmm.
And then we've got a little group of them that don't get exposed to lavender oil and a little group that do. And that's interesting. And then we look at the epigenetic marks that are changing, a few specific ones that maybe are pretty well characterized in the research. Well, what's crazy is that because you're growing the cells in so much estrogen, what you usually are doing is you're killing the cells that aren't estrogen hardy, that can't adapt to that estrogen level. You just straight up kill those cells. So then you end up basically studying estrogen sensitized cells. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I see.
And then you add lavender essential oil and you compare it to a group of another group of already estrogen sensitized cells. And yeah, you see a difference, but
I
it's
see. But does it?
blunted. So you're kind of blunting the response by growing the cells in all these estrogen chemicals to begin with. And that's a struggle because I've approached a lab at the Mayo Clinic I was collaborating with doing stem cell research, and we were looking at osteoarthritis because we inject these stem cells back into joints sometimes, and this was just like within this last year here. And there's a paper your audience can look it up. It's a cool paper. It's something about osteoarthritis is caused by estrogen related receptor activation. It's caused, and that's a big, strong word in science. You have to show gain of function, you have to show loss of function, how that
Mm.
both of those things will literally cause the impact. In this case, osteoarthritis, joint inflammation.
Is this part of the
Um,
reason you think that it's more prevalent in women?
oh yeah,
Or
yeah.
right?
It's
Okay.
two. It's at least two or threefold more found in women, including arthrofibrosis, scar tissue in the joints.
Women have not got
Absolutely.
much going
That's
for them
exactly.
with osteoarthritis, osteoporosis, like all this stuff.
Breast cancer. Yeah. Well, men too, because we're dropping our testosterone. That's having systemic changes. I mean, it's lowering our lifespan, for
True.
one.
So you were saying about the tribesmen when they tried to take blood levels from
Yeah.
really remote
Yeah.
tribesmen, and I'm guessing you were going to say they have more, they still have
Yeah.
phthalates
They
available.
still have phthalates. Yeah. Thanks for bringing it back.
Oh man,
Well,
so
and as you probably saw in my book, the polar bears even have them.
it's ridiculous. So like even the most remote animals and things. So basically like we're getting that these things is that do they remain in the bloodstream because we don't have an endogenous way to process these chemicals, and so they just kind of stick around?
It's a big problem. Yeah. Compared to like soy, right? A lot of people argue about soy, including scientists. Some of them think it's just fine. Some of them think it's beneficial. Some of them think it's harmful. I tend to think that it's a negative thing to have a lot of soy.
Mhm.
But at least your gut bacteria have seen the phytoestrogen, the plant estrogens, and they know how to deal with them. And some of the breakdown products of those phytoestrogens can actually be healthy. And that's where you get a lot of discrepancy. It's like, well, what's your gut bacteria status? If you're
Right.
studying plant estrogen. But if you start studying phthalate, that gets all thrown out the window. Who cares what your gut bacteria looks like? Because they've never seen phthalates. They don't know what the hell. And and with the polar bears, it's working up the food chain, as you know. So you get them in the fish, you get them in the minnows, they get up in the bigger fish, etc., in the seals, and they've done
So it becomes
studies
more
on
and more
seals,
concentrated each time it goes up
and
the
it
food
gets in the
chain.
fat. Yep, and it
So
stores in the fat.
so the concern here is that like these polar bears are they're not getting in cars every day, at least not to my knowledge, filling up, being exposed to petrol and receipts and vinyl floors and that kind of thing, and they're still getting some access to it.
Yep.
How much of the exposure to estrogen that we're getting is environmental? So, how much is stuff that's just unavoidable unless we went and tried to live like totally off grid? And how
Yeah.
much is like within our own control? And because what I'd like to really pin down is whether the environmental impact and the environmental exposure that we get from stuff like pollutants and that kind of thing that we just can't escape, is that so great that we are pissing in the wind by trying to modify our use of cosmetics and things, or can the things that we do ourselves still have an impact and still
Yeah.
protect us to an extent? Does that make
Yeah.
sense?
Oh, yeah, for sure, and that's a great question. So I'm friends with a guy named Dr. Michael Skinner. He gave a TED talk, something about ancestral ghosts in your genome, I think it's called, and it's a great TED talk. It's about epigenetics. He studies epigenetics of estrogen chemicals and some other chemicals too, but he literally grows about 5,000 mice at any given time. I mean, that's a huge colony of mice.
Mm,
And he does multi-generational studies with the mice.
what a monster, right?
Yeah, which is, well, it's such needed research. And
Yeah.
he is super pessimistic about these effects. He basically says we're all screwed, at least over lunch with me personally. I don't think he's saying that publicly too much. But then what was really funny is his daughter is about in their 20s and she's pregnant, and he literally bought her a $5,000 whole house filtration system for her water. And it's like, well, if you think we're all
What a
screwed
great
and
gift.
you're really, yeah. I mean, he's like really serious about avoiding. And honestly, I don't even tell people to go that extreme. I mean, just filter the water you're drinking, and like, I mean, yeah, a little bit's going to get in your skin from the shower or something like that. But I think there's a huge difference between like these ones we're breathing in the air from plastics. And yeah, that's a concern. There's literally a paper that's published that talks about childcare facilities in California. You've probably seen these kind of places. It's just plastic everywhere. It's like plastic pads on the floor, plastic slides,
So
plastic heater tops.
I've just come back from Thailand. I did
Yeah.
a medical placement there, and they love plastic there. Like you'd order a takeaway, and it would be
Yeah.
in 8 layers of plastic. Like, and you'd
Yeah.
have the sauces in a little bag, and the drinks would even be in. Everything was just so.
Yeah,
And it makes me
exactly.
wonder. I don't know whether there's any epidemiological data that looks at effects of estrogen on Thai people or on countries that use a lot of plastic compared to those that don't. But I wouldn't be surprised.
Yeah, sometimes. Yeah, usually what you have to do is you have to just use your own common sense. You're probably not going to find that specific study, but then you have to just look at breast cancer rates in the last 10 years as the estrogen, has ramped up, or the artificial estrogen use. So that's what I generally do. But for in those cases. But yeah, it's super frustrating. And there's papers that talk about just breathing it in the air at these childcare facilities. But honestly, like most of the time, that's not really the impact that you have to worry about. It's, it's the drinking water, it's the cosmetics. Those are the big ones. It's the storing stuff, the food in plastic. And people ask me, well, what about a sandwich? Right? It's like, you don't have to worry about a sandwich. It's dry. There's no exchange of estrogen into a sandwich for the most part. I mean, maybe the tiniest bit, but I mean, come on, like,
I suppose you've got to go for the highest yield stuff, though, don't you? So
you have to. Exactly. And that's what I tried to do in my book, as you probably know. I mean, I set up a gold level plan, a bronze level plan, gold, silver, bronze plans for different people that maybe if you're on if you're on a college student budget, yeah, you don't have to go crazy. You just take the bronze level plan, get the big ones out of your life. And that's even easier over in the UK because in America, I mean, it's a lot more headache.
Yeah, which is what I love about the way you've structured it, because it is just so actionable. And I'd love to cover some of that in a moment, but yeah, because I've made a few substitutions myself, which I'll post in an article and link back to this interview as well. Do you think there is much of so most people listening to this lift weights, they're physique conscious. Do you think that there is a benefit to be gained from in your physique, or at least in your gym performance, from making some of these changes?
Yeah, in fact, there's a gene I look at when I do DNA consulting that's involved in estrogen breakdown. The most consistent one is the CYP1B1 gene. That's a liver enzyme involved in breaking down estrogen. A lot of people have a specific SNP that, just kind of makes that enzyme less than optimal. And so they don't break down estrogen. And in those people, I tell them, you get real serious about artificial estrogen avoidance, because you really see consistent gain issues in the gym with those people. I mean, way more than other people. And most of them already kind of know that. They struggle with it. There's two genes that I look at when I do athletic. I do UFC fighters, I do professional baseball players, all these different professional athletes for DNA consulting. And there's two genes I'm looking. Estrogen, how is your body getting rid of it? I mean, maybe some testosterone genes, but also IGF-1. Because a lot of people have a genetic disposition to lower IGF-1 levels, and that's real predictable. And those people also struggle with putting on the gains. They really do, and in my experience. And that's okay, because it leads to greater longevity, usually. But at least you want to know, is it IGF-1 related or is it estrogen related? Because those are two different. You want to approach those differently if you're struggling with gains and you want to put the gains on.
Right, okay. And so I suppose once you've identified the pathway, and I guess in most cases there is something to be gained from, or there is at least some elevated estrogen exposure with people, if it's kind of almost unanimous, then right. If someone were to make those changes, would they be able to expect to see changes typically, or would it very much depend on whether they have the CYP1 gene?
Yeah, well, if they have the CYP issue, I just tell them be more extreme than most people. Don't mess around with soy and all this. I mean, you can have fermented soy, it doesn't matter, but I just tell them be more extreme. Because for most people, I think they need to relax a little bit. They get a little bit too, like with the BPA on the receipts and things, I think is going a little bit too far. But, if you're working with receipts, that's a different story. But like,
I see. But
I don't want people to get too hypochondriac, where they're just thinking about it all the time.
Well, I heard someone say worrying about your cortisol is the surest way to increase your cortisol. But
that's awesome. Yeah, but I think the big ones, right? Like those are going to decrease everyone's gains. If you're drinking water out of plastic pitchers all the time in plastic bottles, I don't care if it says BPA free or not. You're getting BPS, bisphenol S. There was just a study last week that came out on that, saying that it's causing multi-generational problems. There's other studies that show
so
BPS.
Annoying. Because you think you're doing well by being like, oh yes, it's BPA free, and then you're like, oh, I'm just getting screwed from some other form that's just as bad. So, right. and I suppose from what you said, like these things, it still is enough to seep into what we're taking into our bodies and to affect blood levels, and it's not clearing as effectively as just because our livers don't have a natural way of clearing them.
Yeah. And it's a vicious cycle. It's a vicious cycle too. Before we go on, because if you're store these in your fat cells, right? Mm-hmm. And that's what most scientists underestimate is they forget They do toxicity studies and say this is the dose that kills cells. Well, number one, I don't care what kills cells because we're changing epigenetic marks. That's a long-term change. That's slow. It's super low level. It's, comparable to our body's hormone levels. But then number two, yeah, it's not toxic. But then, what's I gonna say?
The,
It'll come
so
to
the
me.
scientists were saying that it kills cells, but you're more interested in this vicious cycle of them
Oh yeah,
affecting
yeah.
you.
See, they bioaccumulate, right? And that's completely overlooked by scientists. It's like, they're storing in your fat, so they continue to signal to your cells to store more fat.
It's
So it's a difficult cycle to break out of. And then number two is they all are or number three, I guess, they're additive, right? So if you've got the lavender essential oil, and then you add the phthalates, and then you add the parabens, and then you add the BPS or the BPA, right? And they're all acting in the same way. But then a scientist comes along and just studies BPS, bisphenol S, or BPA by itself, and then they try and make that kind of the big poster child of estrogen or artificial estrogen. It's like, no, you're forgetting that there's 10 other ones that are also in pretty much everybody. And because they're acting on that same receptor and that same system, I mean, and just to give people a practical thing, hit the sauna. Like the sauna will accelerate your estrogen. You sweat. They've done skin patch studies. Have you ever seen these? Like the studies?
no.
Oh, they're great. I did a couple of YouTube videos on these too. Skin patch, like it's like a nicotine patch without the nicotine. Put them on groups of people that either aren't in saunas or are in saunas, and they find that people sitting in saunas are just loading up those patches with BP. They're sweating out BPA and
That's
phthalates and
cool.
all these estrogen. Yeah, so that's a great way to remove it. And
There's
even exercise, like just lifting heavy, moves your blood, gets your metabolism going, increases your muscles, which increase your hormone balance. So that's a positive vicious cycle in the sense that as you gain more, you balance more.
I see, and I mean, there's so many other benefits to sauna as well. I don't know if you saw the
Yeah,
the
yeah,
little review that is it Rhonda Patrick posted
yeah.
recently. It,
Well, she's nonstop
I get
posting
them
on
mixed up. There's a Rhonda something who's a UFC fighter, and yeah.
Ronda Rousey. No,
Oh,
Ronda
okay,
Patrick.
good Rhonda
Ronda
Patrick.
Patrick is, yeah, she's the sauna. But Jari Laukkanen is the researcher over in Scandinavia. He's the one that did the 20-year study that showed all-cause mortality decreases with sauna use, and you've got to
So
at
cool.
least be in there 10 minutes, 10 to 20 minutes,
However,
three times a week.
yeah, so it's quite a decent hit of sauna, but I mean, it's not an unpleasant thing to do at all. It's pretty lovely. But someone mentioned that there are certain maybe I'm getting down the rabbit hole here, Anthony, but there's like
That's
a
okay.
certain glues and adherents that they use to stick the wood in saunas that also it can be estrogenic, and so you really need to use a sauna that's been nailed together rather than glued. And I don't
Could
know
be
if
true.
oh
I
man,
mean, and there's probably, well, at least with that, because there's so much heat, if there is estrogens, I mean, you certainly don't want a plastic sauna, right?
mm,
And some people do, believe me, they get these single person home use saunas that
oh
are
no,
plastic. People email me this stuff all the time. But at least if you've got some glue or something like that, the heat is going to dissipate a lot of that after a couple weeks. Or it's just like having a new car or something. It smells like phthalates initially. It's got that plastic smell. And by the way, we're kind of attracted to that smell. Let's be honest, right?
yeah, the smell
Like
of
it
petrol.
triggers.
So many people I know love the smell of petrol. So
Yeah, some of those. Well, even more so the new car smell, right? Because
yeah,
those phthalates and parabens actually trigger something in our brain that says, "Ooh, estrogen," and like we can't quite communicate it, or we can't quite put our finger on it, but I think there's a biological response there as well.
it's annoying. And you were saying that they're in so many perfumes, but they
Yeah,
disguise it under the label of parfum. And if you've ever read
right.
the labels of something and it says parfum, you think like, I wonder what that is. But you said it's just where they hide because they can have their proprietary blends and not have
Exactly.
to declare what's in it.
Yeah, and what they do, I literally was at a winery 2 weekends ago, just helping pick grapes just for the hell of it because I thought it was cool. And I was one of the people in our group was a professional organic chemist from California who works with corporations. It's like the worst person for me to sit next to picking grapes because, of course, I'm going to say, well, what about 4-methylbenzaldine camphor? Like, why are you putting that in your sunscreen? And she does. She knew right what that is. But so we're talking about all the health problems from her job that she's creating.
Oh
And
no.
um, but um, we were talking about this thing with the phthalates in the perfume, and what these scientists argue is it carries the perfume farther in the air. That's why they use that. In reality, it's because it's cheaper. It's just a cheap filler.
Right.
But what they tell you is that it carries, and it does. You can prove that it actually carries a little bit farther in the air. But I mean, come on, who cares if somebody smells you from a foot away, like an additional foot? You know? But that's what they do.
Ridiculous. Yeah, I mean, it does seem like the odds are so stacked against us that it's pretty scary. But can you talk a bit about your own experience? Like, what first of all, I suppose, what got you into this research, and also, I'd imagine because you have the list of the things that you use yourself. Did you notice any changes in your day-to-day experience, your physique, your how you felt, any of those things from making the substitutions?
Oh yeah. Well, for me, it was a lot more gradual than most people. You know, because I was learning as I went through college, as I went through my PhD. I did my PhD on hormones, and fats and cholesterol, all these kinds of things. So for me, it was too gradual to really notice. But I definitely get testimonials from people. Like I had a guy, he wrote a blog about how he changed his testosterone increased 290% and of course he's an American, so he's got a lot more gains to be made here because we have so many more estrogens. But yeah, I mean, I
We'll have to
definitely.
find the link for that and post it in the show notes as well.
Oh yeah, you should. His name is Gabe, and he I can't. I think his website is Ancient Grains. And if you search that, I bet you it'll come up with 290%.
Cool.
Yeah, but yeah, I mean, I get that all the time. Most people don't write a blog on it, or if they do, I don't ever see it. But anyways, yeah. So I personally, really, I didn't notice that big of a difference, but I'm just so convinced, just based on the biological evidence. And I've got kids, right? I've got 4 kids, so
Yeah.
I'm not gonna mess around and try and wonder about this one or that one. I just, like I say, if I see it, I get rid of it. If the science is really clear about it, I mean, that's why they're making these sunscreens illegal, in Hawaii and in Australia coming up, and they just did it for Jamaica, and it's not sunscreen in general, but it's sunscreen containing oxybenzone, which is one of the benzophenone molecules. Because they're estrogenic and they're killing off coral reef populations,
Right,
so that kind of
interesting.
thing. It's like, yeah, you're not going to notice that your fertility is zero, and unless you're really getting in the fertility clinics and all this, but it can sneak, that kind of thing will sneak up on you, it'll catch you.
I see. So in your case, it was kind of quite gradual, but I guess you've worked with athletes, you've worked with people that send
Yeah.
you testimonials, and a lot of them might come into it the same route that I have and Johnny has, which is like, we discover your stuff, we're like, right, we're going to just test dropping all this stuff, follow the gold, silver, or bronze plan, and then retest, or at least notice what happens in our bodies. What's the typical thing that you see people say in the testimonials?
Well, I've literally seen people go from infertility to fertility, but over the course of like a year, right? Because
Wow.
my book was
Okay.
published about a year. I mean, and the biggest one is testosterone, though, because that one is so quantifiable.
So
I like to see people do what you do, and I don't know what your numbers are. I'm still curious. We should
yeah,
tell you should.
I'll
You
get them
should.
up now if you want.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, yeah. I have no idea because, like I said, in the UK, it's hard, and for people, I don't want people to think they're definitely 100% going to increase their testosterone if they eliminate their estrogens, because some people do and some people don't. Oh, there you go.
so
Um,
so just to read
and
out for the readers,
Yep,
everything was in the normal range apart from free testosterone, which is well below the normal, and sex hormone binding globulin was very high.
hi.
Um,
Right. This was the pre-test,
Pre-test, yeah.
or before removing artificial estrogens. Yeah.
And then estradiol, so estrogen was in the normal range, but as Anthony mentioned earlier on, it wouldn't necessarily show up as estrogen. It might show up as, well, it's more likely as it has is sex hormone binding globulin, which is not
Yep.
something that we want to be high. So yeah,
Yep.
I'll follow up in another 8 weeks time as to what the difference has been. Um, do you see anyone talk about things? So
Oh, so wait, so you haven't done the next test
I haven't
yet?
done the post test, no. So I'm
Oh,
still, yeah, but
I thought you were going to reveal on the air and then say,
oh man,
like it's this or that.
to be
No, that's
continued.
cool. Well,
Well,
that's exciting. Now I have to like really pay attention
oh
here.
yeah, well when it's complete, I'll add a little edit to this podcast or put it in the show notes to of the before and after. But I guess you're getting people claim so increases in testosterone, but also anything about the downstream effects of testosterone. So things like body composition, sex
Oh, for sure.
drive, that kind of thing.
Oh yeah, oh, yeah, for sure. Even depression. Um, and my following isn't massive. I don't have one of these giant followings, and I'm not interested in having a giant following. Although it's mostly because I do research in a lab, as a full-time job, and then I go home and I do DNA consulting. And I'm not a super present person on social medias platforms, and I don't spend a lot of time on it. I was just with a bodybuilder down in Florida, pre Mr. Olympia. They just had Mr. Olympia recently.
Hmm.
And the guy I was working out with, I was literally doing in between sets. I was working out with the guy that got second place there, in the 212 category. His name was Derek Lunsford. But, I was going through the estrogen stuff with these guys, and we've already done this in the past. But, there, there's such a difference between obviously that level of person, and then just like the average guy. And then it's like, it's like anything else, like the 80-20 principle. When you first do something and you're just blasted with artificial estrogen, you're going to have that 80, you're going to have a lot bigger, or even if you've never worked out, right? And then you go to the gym, you're going to have this explosion of gains.
Yeah.
But then if you've already kind of gotten past that point and you're already kind of plateauing, yeah, you're going to have to work for those gains. And I think there's like that's like the more advanced stage.
But this is all the more reason that, if someone's in that position, they're just getting incremental gains at this point, but there's so much low-hanging fruit with estrogen.
Yeah.
Then yeah, like you stop getting blasted from it. Yeah, maybe you're still getting some exposure from some stuff, but as you said, like you drink. I need to get a water filter because that's the one thing I haven't done in your list. Because yeah, like the one thing that you always drink every day and loads of it is water, and so
Yeah.
it would make sense to use that as one of the things to get a handle on. So that is pretty interesting then. So there has been people that have been able to elicit some improvement from doing the recommendations in the book.
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
What are your thoughts on zinc for
Yeah.
testosterone?
I've seen the studies. Usually, you have to. What's the supplement where they combine it with something?
Zinc and
It's
magnesium aspartate.
yeah, those are the two. And of course that was probably some biased research because Victor Conte was the guy that developed ZMA,
Mm-hmm.
which
Just
is
a proprietary blend. It was just like
pretty much, yeah.
yeah.
But he's the one that spearheaded a lot of those studies that showed that those increased testosterone, and that's pretty slight increase. But what's really ironic with testosterone is a lot of the micronutrients. Of course, you would assume like, oh, it's a micronutrient that's going to increase my testosterone. A lot of them decrease testosterone, or they've never been studied, which is wacky, right? It's like how
Right.
easy of a study is that to just throw some micronutrients. And of course, if you've got a supreme deficiency in any micronutrient, you're going to have low testosterone from that. But assuming you're somewhat normal, just increasing it above that level or having really high levels, it actually can lower testosterone in a lot of cases with these various metals, especially. And then the research gets iffy there because, and this is true of estrogen too, so this is relevant. Like manganese is a good example, right? And because Tim Ferriss especially made it popular that manganese increases testosterone, which it does.
Mm-hmm.
But if you take it consistently at a high dose, it actually ends up lowering your testosterone below what it was to start
Oh
with.
really? Yeah, because he's
Because
big on
the
selenium
receptor-
as well, isn't he?
Selenium, yeah, exactly.
But
That's what I think I meant to say selenium.
Because
I can't remember.
manganese,
Yeah.
I think manganese is. You mentioned about saunas before. I heard a really cool case study about a guy who he was one of the firefighters that did part of the cleanup after 9/11, and he developed a Parkinsonian tremor, or what appeared to be a Parkinsonian one, and he did this sauna protocol where he took lots of, I think it was vitamin B6. That's the one that causes the flush and the vasodilation? Anyway, some B vitamin, and did sauna multiple days in a row, and his towel was soaked. It was like covered in this kind of purple residue when he wiped off his sweat. And they tested it, and it was manganese, and then his tremor stopped. And so what must have happened, or they hypothesized, was that during the cleanup, he'd inhaled a lot of the heavy metals from the construction.
Sure.
And which caused this kind of neurotoxicity.
Well, I mean, I just pulled up my little sheet from some of the research I was doing, and most of it's in animals, right? But again, like having extreme deficiency is one thing, but and so is having an extreme excess. But even just increasing it slightly, like Vandate is one of these ones that can lower testosterone, at least in animals. Nickel has been shown to lower testosterone. Cobalt lowers testosterone. Of course, mercury, but that's, But what's funny is lead actually increases testosterone. So like there's some of these ones you actually wouldn't predict, if you start going through the list. Aluminum decreases it. So people cooking on aluminum foil, arsenic, selenium, like you said, it's interesting.
Man. So it's all very mixed then. So like, is it worth like going through these, or are there any kind of high yield stuff that someone who wants to improve their physique, improve their hormone profile, particularly as a male, are there any kind of high yield stuff that you think they can do both to minimize their estrogen impact and also to maximize testosterone?
Yeah, I mean, iodine has been one that's shown to increase it. I would focus on the ones that increase it. And, some people take these, I think micronutrients get way over exaggerated in the testosterone field, because people are trying to bring up their testosterone naturally. And one of the first things a lot of people do is say, oh, let's go to micronutrients. But the ones that work, besides lead, because you don't want to go there, would be chromium, cadmium, iodine, and honestly,
boron as well. I don't know if that's very well studied.
Yeah, let me just look at my list here.
The boron study I saw was quite a small one, so I don't know whether
boron. Yeah, no, that's been shown to increase T in the studies they've done. Magnesium, like you said, zinc with aspartate, and then calcium as well. So yeah, I mean, there's definitely some micronutrients that you can focus on, but I think just globally, just trying to take all of them, it might be counterproductive. So you want to focus on the ones that work. Yeah.
Right. And then is there anything outside of micronutrition that you think is...
Oh, yeah, for sure. I'm kind of slowly working on a book in the background on this, because just that list alone, people want to see, right? They want to see what micronutrients, and that's why I was researching it. And it's appalling how few studies there are,
Right.
You'd think it's such an easy study. Let's just add some bromide to some rats and just see how they're at least do something like that, right? It's so easy. And publish some papers, get some additional grant funding. I don't know. But what's really interesting to me is the LPS, like the lipopolysaccharide, and gut health.
Yeah, okay.
Increasing your bad bacteria and LPS into your bloodstream decreases testosterone for sure. And that's I think that's related to stress too. So people talk a lot about cortisol, and the research is so all over the place with that. But one thing the research is not all over the place is if you've got bad gut bacteria and they're leaking LPS into your blood, you're lowering your testosterone from that.
Right, that's interesting. So LPS, and there's a really good article on LPS that I'll link in the show notes. I can't remember the name of the blog, but it's something like Biohacker or whatever.
Yeah, I've seen the same one. I love that article.
It's
blue
great.
Color, greenish blue.
That's the one. And the other stuff that we recommend typically, it would just be, it's boring, but lifting, vitamin D, sleeping beyond 7 hours a night, and eggs, just because of the cholesterol. But those answers are not very sexy, and I think people kind of think like, oh, well, I wanted like the one secret to improve test, but
the gut bacteria, there you go, we got it. That's a new one for people, because most people don't really I've literally, I've had people that really struggle with this, and I'll tell them, and again, I do DNA consulting, so I do this every day. I've got multiple people, and I'm sitting there talking to them on Skype for an hour. And I'll tell people, like, you need to go camping for a week. Just
Yeah,
take a week off of work and go out in the woods, find somewhere remote and go camping and watch your testosterone just totally reverse. You got crappy testosterone, you watch,
so
because
is
your
that,
gut bacteria will just transform.
oh, I see, but is that because of being in a different airspace
Oh, there's
or?
so many, yeah, for sure. There's so many variables, right? It's like anything else. Who knows like you're probably eating healthier because you're designing your meals a lot more carefully because you're going out somewhere
Mm.
into the woods. But I mean, there's so many variables, but the gut bacteria, I think, are definitely changing. And yeah, I can't prove it with a study yet, but
No, I think I've seen something about it's almost like your gut bacteria respond to the actual location that you're in, and when people are in a new location, they don't um, that they're just not adapted to it. It's like I can't. I'm gonna have to find it because I'm just gonna butcher this study if I try and yeah. But I imagine,
interesting.
as you said, like
Yeah,
being out in nature,
yeah,
the whatever those the things that are released from trees that modulate cortisol and being the electrochemical effect of being grounded on the floor outside and
yeah. There's a
away
lot
from
of
all the
factors.
EMF and
Yeah,
all that stuff. Yeah, so
yeah,
pretty
and
interesting.
I think all of those things are factors, but I think the gut bacteria transformation is probably the most dramatic in terms of improving your testosterone. And taking probiotics is kind of iffy in terms of how much of an effect that's going to have, and that's so unique and individualized. And the science is pretty difficult to recommend. Oh, this is the probiotic you need in your situation. That's
Mhm.
so iffy, but nothing like getting out in the wilderness. That's the probiotic you need.
Right, I see. So that plus the dietary changes in that LPS article that I'll link as well, and
Yep. Yep.
people are
Yep.
on their way. That's cool. Anthony, I've got a couple more questions for you, and then hopefully wrap things up. I realise it's early morning for you, so um,
It's okay.
um, I emailed you about resveratrol because
Yep.
resveratrol is one of those things that's considered in the sports supplement world to be a naturally
Anti-aging.
derived anti-estrogen or kind of estrogen modulator.
Yep.
And your answer, you were saying like it's actually pro-estrogenic in some cases and anti-estrogenic on others, and so it's not really a clear answer.
Yeah.
So on
Yeah.
balance, would you say that it's a kind of was it a yes or a no for someone who's training again, just looking to improve their physique?
Yeah. Exactly. That's the approach. I mean, again, if you're a pro athlete, you probably don't want to mess with it. It's like there's other ways to be anti-estrogenic that don't have the potential for being pro-estrogen. And diindolylmethane is the same thing, right? Like a lot of people say, "Oh, you should supplement DIM." How come you didn't recommend in your book supplementing DIM, which is
Oh,
DIM,
the Poliquin
diindolyl?
recommendation, isn't it?
Is it? Yeah. I mean, a lot of people, and that's another one that it can actually decrease your estrogen. You can find those studies, but it also can increase your estrogen. You can find those studies, and it's a super dose dependent thing. It's not the study's fault. It's just dose dependent, and it differs between different people. So I'm not going to recommend DIM just globally for people because it might start increasing your estrogen.
Right, I
You
see. So,
know?
so there's no supplements, I guess, that would do that. What about things
Yeah.
like clomiphene, tamoxifen? So these are kind of the selective estrogen reuptake modulators that are pharmacologic drugs that we would give.
Yeah. I mean,
I say that we
you
would
know,
give, but
Yeah,
yeah.
well, no, I talked to a lot of people that are on testosterone, and taking aromatase inhibitors can be smart, in certain situations. But yeah, I mean that stuff gets in the weeds really fast, and the problem is it gets so personalized. I mean, I definitely don't have like a global supplement that I recommend for people to like lower your estrogen, except sauna, and that's
Mhm.
not really a supplement. I mean, that's the global one. That one I can bank on. You're going to sweat out estrogens. But the actual like ingesting something, honestly, like, yeah, it's too. I mean, if you're burning fat, right? One of the things I like about the keto diet is when you transform your body into burning fat for fuel. If you're eating like 80% fat by calories, one of the reasons I appreciate that, and it actually increases your testosterone, it's because you're burning these fat stores where these estrogens have been hanging out, and the average lifespan of a fat cell is a year and a half, and they can live up to 10 years. They've done this radioactivity studies. And so, those estrogens can hang out for a long time, but if you're burning the triglyceride droplets off, you're going to secrete more, you're going to shrink those fat cells, you're going to get the estrogens out, and you're probably going to have an impact just from that.
Right, that's cool. Um,
Yeah,
so keto diet and sauna are the two things that could at least clear out the fat cells from the latent estrogens that are in there.
right.
I'm guessing. So I'm guessing clomiphene and tamoxifen. Is that a no, or is it just that like can't
That's
recommend?
that's a personalized thing, I think. Yeah, I don't have any issue there. It's just like I say, it gets too customized to just throw it out there for everybody. In my mind,
Mm,
I mean, what I what I often do is I recommend positive epigenetic regulators, like sulforaphane is one, which modulates your. And some people actually can find studies that show that's a little bit estrogenic if you have crazy high doses. But I mean, come on, we're not taking crazy high. Like if you give like a rat like half of its body weight and sulforaphane, it's like, well, yeah, that's not real, and that's not going to happen in humans.
right, I see. So it's yeah, because I mean, after you said about the resveratrol, I was like, well, if you just block the estrogen receptor, then surely that. But then I don't know whether
You
would
might
you.
upregulate.
Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
yeah.
So
And that's exactly what happens. It gets complicated in that sense, and that's hard to quantify. Between people it varies so much, and between different tissue types. So if you took out breast cells and you're studying those, it would differ between your kidney cells or your liver cells, and then because your liver is important with estrogen, because then you're secreting clotting factors, and your blood clots might go up. I mean, that's what you see with birth control users. You get a lot more blood clotting problems. So yeah, you're exactly right. It gets really complicated really
this
fast.
is one of the things like with when they give tamoxifen to postmenopausal women, and it might increase the risk of breast cancer but decrease the risk of endometrial cancer because of the different
Yep.
receptors.
Alpha
Yeah.
beta. Yeah. Yeah, because
So
there's estrogen receptor alpha and estrogen receptor beta. And what's funny is the vegans, for some reason, they seem really emotionally attached to
the
soy.
vegans.
Like, yeah, and because I get them all the time, right? They're sending me messages and saying, because I don't think people should be eating a ton of soy. I mean, it's
Mhm.
not natural. If you go in a soybean field, and they're all over the place here in Minnesota, and you eat soybeans, you can only eat like 10 of them, and you're just disgusted. It's like, oh, these things. Initially, it's like, oh, this is okay, but your body just tells you, yeah, this is ridiculous. Let's stop doing this. But if you process the heck out of them, put a ton of salt on them, you can eat a mountain of tofu,
Right.
and
Okay.
that's loaded with phytoestrogen.
What? So you get
And then for
vegans that are
some,
offended because you're saying don't eat soy.
yeah, yeah, they're really emotionally attached to it. And not all of them, but I'm sure there's reasonable ones out there. But
No,
those aren't the ones that contact me.
you're absolutely. I mean, it seems to be our experience with vegans as well. I don't know. I don't know what it is. There must be
Like,
some
off
effects that's
yeah.
yeah, but
Well,
they get
it's probably estrogen related. It's probably that emotional response. Because it's really funny, Yusuf. There's publications, and a lot of people want me to write on this, and I'm trying to, but it's a politically charged topic. But there's publications that literally talk about male feminization from artificial estrogens. And when I say that, people are like, oh, like there's not even a difference between men and women. So how can you?
uh,
But it's like, come on, like that's just politics, right? But
mm,
I've talked to scientists that study estrogen behind closed doors. They all tell me, oh, of course, male feminization occurs, right? Even just lowering testosterone is a form of male feminization. But like, for example, in frogs, if you hit them with 200 nanograms per deciliter of atrazine, they change. The males start to change into females. And then
yeah. I
in our
remember you saying
drinking,
there's some like sexual dimorphism even in like mountain stream fish, and
yeah, in Switzerland, yeah. And that's and in that case, that was because of a river that was pouring into that lake from a city
okay,
that had birth control. So they traced that one back, but it's in the middle of nowhere, so you'd think you're fine. But yeah, sure enough, even that one. But yeah, like the male feminization issue is legit. Like you're switching your hormones out. It's almost like some kind of a therapy, but an anti-therapy.
mm.
And most scientists don't want to use that term. They don't want to say male feminization, but even some of the publications will straight up say that, and some of
I've
them
got
just
no
call
patience for when for people not liking the outcome of scientific data,
data,
and
right?
yeah, and therefore being like, oh no, you shouldn't be saying
Yeah,
that, and it's just an obstruction to the our progress as humans, and it's causing us to cycle backwards as a
right.
population. To yeah, so um, I like I'll certainly defend you if you post that article about the male feminization, because this is
Oh,
simply what the data's saying.
and the reason I brought it up, right, is because I think, if you're hammering even phytoestrogens all the time, if you're just pounding those and, straight lining plant estrogens, and then who knows what other estrogens you're adding on top of that cocktail, you're probably going to have emotional changes that are happening in your brain. You've got estrogen receptors in your, and what's funny about the vegan argument, and this is the vegan argument because Dr. Michael Greger he's the one that proposes this argument and everybody latches onto it. He's the guy that wrote a book called How Not to Die, and it basically just says you can't eat meat, it's worse than smoking.
Okay.
And it's silly, but but I'm reading that book right now, actually, so it's pretty fresh in my head. I'm just kind of going through it to see, because he's got some good stuff to offer as well. Like for example, he recommends changing your chronic illness by changing your diet, right? And him and I totally agree with that. It's like, the first line of defense should not be a pill. You shouldn't rush to the doctor and say, give me a pill to suppress my symptoms. It should be, how can I change my diet? Change my diet again, until you got it locked down, and hopefully your chronic thing goes away. If last resort, yeah, go to the doctor for sure, and keep the doctor in the loop this whole time, because you want to be checking your blood, you want to be monitoring. But anyways, but his argument with the vegan, the soy, and all this is, there's estrogen receptor alpha and there's estrogen receptor beta. All right. And he argues that the plant estrogen, and he's got this YouTube video where he puts the paper up on the screen and it shows, like soy phytoestrogen more specifically binds one of those receptors and not the other one, alpha instead of beta. Mm-hmm. And that protects you against breast cancer. Right. And because the breast tissue only has the other receptor. Right.
Right.
But what's really funny is I looked up that paper, because I was like, man, that's a good argument. I can go with that. That's cool. And maybe that's one of the reasons there's such a discrepancy here with the soy plant estrogens instead of gut bacteria. So I looked up the paper, and the second figure, like, that's one figure. Okay. But then the next figure used a different cell type that was just in cells, and they used a totally different cell line just from a different person, and it showed the exact opposite. And it's like, well, he's cherry picking completely.
This is the problem when you've got someone like you, who's an absolute nuclear warhead with estrogen research, reading a book that just throws out a citation and hopes that no one reads it.
Yeah, it's frustrating. But you can be a vegan without pounding estrogens too. I think it's a perfectly valid thing to do.
Like, to be honest, as much as we take the mick out of vegans a lot, and we upset a bunch of them the other day because we posted a photo that had, I don't know if you saw it on our Instagram, that was like during the storm, the hurricane, and the supermarkets has been ransacked, but then the vegan section is completely intact. But
yeah, of course,
people got very upset about that. But no, I very much admire the mission of saving animals and reducing the amount of total suffering in the world and all of that. Maybe it's my moral failing that I'm not disciplined enough to not eat meat. But yeah, at the same time, sometimes the way they go about propagating their mission is a very much a religious approach.
Yeah, a lot of people do. Even I think every diet has those people, the keto guys, there's some people there, the carnivore guys especially, there, yeah, you find them. And that's one of the reasons I like doing DNA, because people are different. I don't want anybody to be ideological about one diet versus another one. I want to see what's your genetics and how does that vary, and how are your epigenetics? What were you exposed to growing up, or how's your working out? What's your age? It's just like stem cells. I told you before, I'm doing stem cell research. If you take stem cells out of a male versus a female and inject them into somebody, you get a different outcome. If you take them out of an old person versus a young person and inject them into somebody, you get a different outcome. If you get them, like, say you take them out of a keto diet guy and then you take them out of an average American, you're going to get a different outcome with those stem cells. And we're trying to do these studies. Yeah, and it messes up. It gets all the research confounded, and
Talking to you is like talking to a quantum physicist once you get down to the really high level, the really sort of deep level of mechanisms.
No, I think it's just common sense, right? It's like, but the problem is in America, we're pretending like there's no difference between the standard American diet and like a normal, like somebody else who's not on the standard. we're pretending in the scientific research that's not a difference.
Hmm.
And so those stem cells shouldn't matter. Like, but of course there's a difference, right? Like you can quantify the difference. Just look at the hormones. That's a good place to start, right? Look at the insulin. I mean, my brother, he's a nurse's assistant. He sees people commonly like in the 200 range for glucose in their blood. And I don't know if that's like, you guys probably are doing millimolar, so it's like
Yeah,
totally different.
is it just multiplied by 10? So it'd be people with over, because
Yeah, I don't
we,
know,
we
honestly.
would say the normal range would be between, say, 4 and 8. Um,
Interesting. Yeah.
so
Yeah,
I
you'd have
don't
to
know.
look up the American values for that, but like you definitely want to be under 100 in America. You probably
Oh,
want to
okay,
be under, you actually want to be under 90
so it sounds like it's, yeah, multiplied by 10 then. So
or
yeah,
probably a little bit,
so like
but
very
maybe not.
hyperglycemic.
Like double what it should be, literally, and that's like super common. And, you know, it's like, yeah, anyways, the point is like there's a lot of variation from people, but these studies are muddling a lot of this up.
I see. Yeah, I've heard some crazy things about American diabetes approach, but I think this kind of comes down to, and we spoke with Kamal Patel from Examine.com about this.
Oh yeah, yeah,
Yeah, a great guy, and he was just saying how the British healthcare system, I don't know how it compares to Canada, but is very much defensive medicine, under treating, under investigating, and the American system is very over investigative because of the different profit potential, and
yeah, yeah.
cost driven versus profit driven approaches. And yeah, seeing when I went to New York, seeing the way that people, that like over the counter drugs were being advertised on TV, and it's
Yeah,
just so
yeah,
it's so foreign to me. Like, and
yeah,
I've heard of like you have someone who's obese in a diner, and is injecting insulin before having a cheesecake,
yeah,
or like
yeah, yeah.
just like there's a lot of some crazy differences with the way that things are done, and that someone
Right.
might
I
come in with a cut on their
know.
finger and they'll get a CT scan of their head just in case they sue the doctor, and yeah,
Yeah, yeah, yeah, yeah, yeah. It's all centered around covering your ass. The COA or whatever it's called. Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
Cool.
That's America.
Oh man.
But
Well, Anthony, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. I will definitely follow up with you about the results of our test. As long as you think 12 weeks is long enough between tests, otherwise we can.
it should be. Yeah, it should be. It should give you an increased rate. I mean, obviously, testosterone can change day to day, and that makes it difficult.
Yeah.
But so, and that's true. Again, I want to remind everybody else who are doing this at home, the more time points you can do, the better. The more tests you can do, the better. It doesn't have to be 20 of them. It could just be a couple, but it's better to have more and more just to increase your confidence.
Yeah, so
Yep.
the total accuracy of the data. How can people find out more about you and your book, your website, social
Yeah.
media?
Yeah, I mean, the best place is ajconsultingcompany.com, which is a terrible name, but I made it up way back when I was doing some research for the US government on viruses. And I was actually creating lentivirus in the lab from DNA. I was injecting,
Oh
I was
man,
putting, I was transfecting DNA into live cells, and then the cells were making virus for me. So I was designing virus, which was
oh, that's
kind of
cool.
cool. But then they had to make a consulting company at the time, so I just threw down, hey, let's just call it AJ Consulting Company. It doesn't really matter, right? And now I'm stuck with that stupid egotistical name. But that's where people could find me.
Cool. Well, I suppose you can always get a domain redirect eventually or
I
something.
could,
But
I could. I'm just too busy. Yeah,
cool. And
not a
then
rich.
your book as well, Estrogeneration, definitely worth checking out if any of this has piqued your interest and you want to dive more into that. And subscribe to find out more about Anthony's new book that's coming out soon. I will definitely be on that about optimizing hormones in general. So I'm guessing that's the
Oh,
kind of like
thanks.
the practical side of things.
Yeah, oh yeah. And I mean, I'm working on a book on DNA because I'm obsessed with that and epigenetics, a two-part book that kind of go together. I'm going to try and release those at the same time. I have a lot of books up in the air I'm kind of working on, and it's hard to predict when those are going to come out. I keep thinking I have it figured out, but then it's more work than I thought. So yeah, but stay posted on that because it's interesting and fun. I'm trying to make it simple for people.
Oh, cool. Yeah, I definitely know the feeling with that. I wrote two articles recently, one on posture and one on satiety, so hunger regulation. Both of them I
Yeah.
thought, oh, I'll be able to knock something out in 1,000 words. It'll be pretty.
Yeah.
And then
Yeah.
as soon as you dive in, it's such a rabbit hole.
That's
But
science. Yeah.
it is. Anthony, thank you. I'll speak to you very soon.
All right, Yusuf, thanks.